I'm joined today by the wonderful Andrew Copson, who is Chief Executive of Humanists UK and Global President of Humanists International. Is that right, Andrew? Have I got
Yes,
that right?
currently
That's
president.
fantastic. Now, I actually told my mum that you were coming on the show, and I said, "Mum, I think you'll be interested in Andrew because of what he does kind of professionally. Um, and do you know what a humanist is?" And she said, "Yes, I know what a humanist is." I said, "Okay, great. Well, we'll put that question out of the way." But she did actually have a question for you,
Oh yeah,
and I'll
absolutely.
I'll get it up. By the way, I don't know how much you kind of know about my mum, but she's very religious, but in a kind of radical way, which I think is probably it's obviously not humanism, but it's probably the closest someone like her could get to humanism.
She's
And
free thinking.
she's free thinking exactly. So she doesn't. So she's not quite doctrinal, if that's even a word. But she's gay and she's out, and she goes to church regularly, but she believes all the kind of liberal things about women's rights to choose, etc. Her question, if I bring it up, is here we go. The first I sent this on the 1st of January on New Year's Day. The first of the 12th, 2023 will be World's AIDS Day, and previously was assigned World Conscientious Objectors Day
Yes.
for people refusing to serve in the military and or being conscripted. As this is presently a shared event, should not people of both groups be assigned a day? Which I think is a sort of slightly tortuous way of asking the question, but I think you get the question around will conscientious objects. But just for sort of
Yeah.
listeners who don't understand, tell us a bit about that and how humanists are kind of involved.
Well, that's an interesting question actually, because it's interesting that a religious person should ask a humanist about World Conscientious Objectors Day, because the World Conscientious Objectors Day in the UK is actually a mixed humanist and religious ceremony. So in Tavistock Square here in London, there's a stone that's been erected to conscientious objectors, or they don't quite use that phrase. They use the men and women who have established and continue to defend the right not to kill.
Wow.
And there's an annual ceremony there with Quakers and humanists and other religious people who object. So I definitely think there should be a bigger day. I'd like to think that day should be as big as Remembrance Day, really, for us, because there are plenty of people in our society and around the world who deserve the same sort of remembrance that those who fought have. So I agree with her about that. Humanism, which she already knows all about, but maybe your listeners don't.
Yes.
For the last 150 years, the word humanist has come to mean someone who's not religious, but more specifically, they put human welfare and the welfare of other sentient animals at the centre of their morality. They believe that the universe itself doesn't have a purpose or a meaning or a direction, and that it's human beings who are creating meaning through the way we live our lives, the stories we tell ourselves about our lives in our head, the things we do, the connections we make. And I suppose also there's something about how we make sense of the universe there. Humanists don't look to revelations or ancient texts or personal encounters to understand the way the world and the universe works. They look to human observation, human senses, and now obviously the big organised enterprise of science to do those things. That's a potted definition, Paul. So I mean, there are many longer books than that which will tell
I
you
think that's
more.
an amazing definition. And of course, you've written on this, haven't you?
Yes, that's true. Yes, The Little Book of Humanism, Sunday Times bestseller, still available in all good bookshops. That's a very short book about it, which is probably best for the general reader. Little Book of Humanism. It was enjoyable to write actually, because we got lots of. I wrote it with Alice Roberts, who was the president of Humanists UK at the time, so scientist and science broadcaster. And it was very interesting to write it with her because she was very sciencey, I was very history and artsy and literary. So it was good to have quotes from famous scientists next to quotes from James Baldwin, and to mix up sort of the two cultures of humanism, because we do get a lot of people involved in humanist organisations from the science point of view, and in history there have been, in the past there have been more, now less so, but I think still a good number of historians and writers and literary artist figures and so on, and I think you always need to keep those two aspects of humanism in balance with each other, and the book was a good fist at that.
And I suppose the obvious question is, how did you come to humanism? And if there are sort of, without kind of wanting to make it sound like other organised, it's not an organised religion, but like organised religions, if there are two sort of strands informing it, where do you sit, or kind of where do you fall?
In terms of what I've just described as the two different ways of, I think that's an interesting question. I thought you were going to ask me about sort of my conversion story. Or,
Oh God, is there a conversion?
No, there
story?
isn't actually,
Okay,
but people do ask. Maybe we'll come to that in a minute because it's
Okay.
quite interesting because it's about my mum as well.
Right.
Well, I'm obviously more on the arts and humanities side of things. So my way into humanism wasn't the sort of science and reason aspect at all. In fact, I'm not that interested in science. I don't, which is
Spoiler alert.
I know exactly, and I mean it's very useful and good,
Yes,
and I'm
yeah.
glad that people enjoy it. Obviously, it's brought us immense advantages, and it's nice better than fear and ghosts and the unknown. But really, my appreciation of the humanist approach to things is born out of contemplating the human story. Really, I just think that human beings, incredible creatures. Born in a meaningless universe, but able to carve out a space for meaning and purpose and relationships. I'm more interested in the sort of, not in the way that we make sense of the outside universe, but more our inner life, really.
Yeah.
That's always been my preference, my interest, and I'm incredibly interested in people, individuals, and their stories. Things. So that's my angle into the humanist approach.
You mentioned your mum.
Yeah, well, of course, because she's a humanist.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that some people, lots of people who become part of humanist organisations have been religious in their youth. Actually, that changes now more. Now that we're a more secular society generally, we get more people who've always been non-religious and want to join for other reasons. But a lot of people in the past, and still a large number today, join because they were raised religious. They've, turned away from all of that. And they had a moment at some point in their lives, not a conversion moment, but a sort of realization moment when they heard the word humanist, realized it described what they already believed and the way they were living their lives, and so they signed up for that. For me, unfortunately, I didn't have to do that much thinking at all about it because that's just the way I was raised, and not just by my mum, but by other generations in my family, or the women in my family, who also had that same view. So I sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable. I think, did I fail to think for myself? Did I fail to challenge what was?
There's a sort of good legacy of humanism in your family.
Definitely, yeah, that's right, and not always conscious. Self-described humanism, really. I mean, it was for my mum because she knew the word, she'd heard the word. But the previous generations of my family who also felt the same way, they just knew they weren't religious, and they weren't part of an educated sort of middle class secularism. They were part of a religion rejecting working class secularism. So sort of like, what are priests for? They just take the working man's money at the end of the week. We don't want any of that. It's nothing for us. And they were unchurched, as the old-fashioned expression used to be.
Horrible phrase. So it's partly out of. This may sound like I'm oversimplifying it, but part of what informed your, I guess, grandmother and great-grandmother's humanism was a little bit of sort of necessity and self-survival, in the sense of you didn't want to get exploited by the church and the sort of men in it.
They didn't want to be exploited by the church. They didn't want to be exploited by men. They didn't have that much to do with men, actually, my grandmother and great-grandmothers. And in fact, they had the sort of lives that would have been very harshly judged by both churchmen and Christianity. I think both my great-grandmothers on my mother's side, I don't think either of them were married when they were first pregnant. I know that my great-grandmother's own mother had an on and off situation with an Irishman in the late 90s. So the other thing is that I should explain, because it sounds like I'm really old now and somehow knew all these generations of my family. They all had children in their mid or late teens.
Okay.
So they were 16, 17, 18, 19 when they had their children. So actually, when I grew up, I did know lots of generations of my family because they were also young when they had their
short
children.
Generations,
exactly, really short generations. So, in fact, I think both of my mothers, both the great grandmothers that were my mother's grandmothers, if you see what I mean, were alive when I was at university. I was an undergraduate. Still then, massively. So. That happens to be why I know them. So they had the sort of lives. So I say my great grandmother's mother had this sort of on-off Irish guy who, in some censuses, we looked at the census once for fun to sort of see in like 1901, 1911. Sometimes he's the lodger, sometimes he's the husband. Then 10 years later, he's the lodger again. No. Sometimes he's not there at all.
Oh my, okay.
It's really funny.
Wow.
And so they were the sort of lives that they had, and also married to coal miners or itinerant labourers or manual workers of different kinds in places where this was not middle class Church of England type territory at all. This was life at the at the sort of the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and I think actually there's always been, in England certainly, probably across Europe, maybe across the world, just a huge amount of people who are just completely uninterested in religion or anti-religion at that level of society, because it's got nothing to do with them, and what it preaches doesn't touch their lives, what it's about doesn't appeal to their experiences, and for women especially, I guess that was true. So that was true of all the generations of women in my family.
I'm going to ask you a question, but I want to make an observation in front of the question, which is, it's so beautiful to hear you kind of describe this community that in part comes from rejection, but also within generations of your family as well. And the reason I reflect on that is, I think for my mum, who, as I said, is probably the closest to being a humanist without being a humanist, if that makes sense, in terms of what you described. Physically going to church, which is I always found a bit weird. It's sort of like a taught habit rather than anything else. But anyway, for her, I think it's a sense of kind of having a community.
Right.
And it doesn't really matter that they're religious, but it's sort of physically being in the same place with people. And, you know, it was interesting with her going through COVID and missing all of that and then sort of returning to it. But the question that I have for you is, thinking about your own mum being raised in that sort of tradition with that sort of deep sense of family and community, from what it sounds like, paint us a picture of, you know, the cradle from which she came and how she you know, sort of adopted or kind of lived the humanist life, because I'd love to sort of start from there with your mum and then work forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think that I mean, I don't want to idealise the situation, because I think that one of the things that my mum experienced, and I have a very frank and open relationship with my mum, you know, so we talk about these things a lot and have done in the past, sort of exhausted all these topics. When she was growing up, I think that having that close and the positive spin on it, supportive grandmothers, and also huge numbers of great aunts as well. I mean, there's just old women as far as I can see in my family. You'd think that was a really positive thing, and I think it was to a large extent. But she also, I think, felt it disrupted her relationship with her own mum quite a lot as well. So I mean, I think she describes. And it's interesting that she describes this because she can't possibly remember it, so it must have been something she'd been told. She describes, you know, when having first been born and sort of brought home, and then immediately being whisked away from her mum to all these other women, you know, grandmothers and great grandmothers and great aunts and so on, and less so with her brother. She has an older brother, and I definitely think that it was less so than with him, because I remember my grandmother used to say that she always felt that my mum, who was her second and final child, had almost been her baby, whereas my uncle had felt like he was just absolutely immediately taken away for the family, like for everyone else.
And nothing to do with gender; it's just sort of happenstance.
I think so. Yeah, that's right. Well, because like I say, I mean, actually, it wasn't a family in which there were many young people or many babies at all. You know, most people were depleted. Most generations were depleted by the time the sort of mid-20th century came along, and many of the women didn't marry and didn't have children. In fact, the majority of them didn't. So I think that, you know, it was a supportive cradle, you know, in a family sense, but also I think probably slightly stifling. And I know that my grandma tried very hard to be what it was not in her instinct to be, a sort of conventional 50s, 60s housewife and mother type figure.
Groovy granny, or sort of
no. I think she had aspirations of conformity, which lasted, I think, unfortunately for my mum, through my mum's childhood, and which she later gave up. I mean, this was not. This was in the context of my grandmother's own 82-year long life. This was a flash in the pan, but unfortunately for my mum, it coincided with my mum's own youth.
Yeah.
So my grandmother went through this sort of like, I'm a 50s housewife phase, tried to be very conventional. It didn't work out well for her at all. And, you know, I think they went once to the bowling club in the village where they'd moved to. And my grandmother hated everyone so much they never went back. And she would like snubbed everyone forever, and lived a different, more alternative life instead. But my mum, I think, actually found her childhood relationship with her grandmother, with her mother, sorry, a little bit stifling because of the unfortunate times in which they were born. And I mean, this is something that people don't talk about very much about the social history of the 50s and 60s, but I think there was enormous pressure post-war for sort of like to get society back to an imagined idea of how it should have been before. And I think that, my grandmother was an unfortunate victim of that, and my mother was the same. So I know, for example, that in spite of the home beliefs, my mum went to Sunday school. It was as conventional as that.
Really?
Yeah.
For religious reasons or kind of educational?
I think for cultural reasons. I
Right.
think, and apparently this is true, that in the 50s and early 60s, there was sort of a big spike in things like christenings and in Sunday schools and so on.
Okay.
And I think it was fed by a sort of national, anti-communist Christian surge. I mean, even when you get agnostic politicians like Winston Churchill talking about Christian civilization in the 40s and 50s, you can tell something's happening that's not religious, it's something else. And I think that my mum was unfortunately part of that. So although the home convictions and beliefs weren't that, she did get plunged into this world. And I would say that she had a much better relationship with her mother as a young adult and later in life than she did. And then she had a very good relationship, a very open and solid relationship with my grandmother, her mother. So I wouldn't say that at the time of her childhood, that was when my mother was really formed. My mum was really formed in the way that your question is about. I would say that was probably older, and I think her best relationship with her own mum was probably once we were born, me and my younger brother, and then again very young. So my mum was earlier than 20, younger than 20 when she had me, and so. And then that sort of began. And my grandmother was very young as well, of course, by that point. I suppose she'd have been about my age, actually.
Wow.
And when I was born. And so I think that's when their relationship really began to be a very good one, very strong one.
Tell us your mum's name, paint us a mental picture, and then let's pick up from where you've described. So you're born. What was she doing in her life? Like what was the sort of how and why did the relationship change?
My mum's name is Julia, and her parents' name was Cunningham. And then when she married my dad, which was a brief marriage, her name was Copson, which obviously is my name, and she never changed her name back, even though she was only married to him for what.
Really?
So I don't know why that was that she never changed it back. That's something I should have asked her. Maybe that'll come later. But she'd left home quite young. She left school at 16. Started work at the local social security office, where she turned up at the age of 16, and some very Gorgon-like, in her memory, Gorgon-like woman who ran the office said, "Why do you want to work at the?" And she said, "Because I want to help people." When she was sort of naive 16, and the woman sort of like laughed and gave her a job, and so she started working there, and I think was there for a few. I think that's the only job she had prior to my being born, actually, and she started work there. At some point, obviously, met my dad. Oh, I'm realising I don't know anything about my dad, actually. I don't know how she met my dad.
Is your dad still in your life? Is still with us?
He died
Sorry.
In 2010.
Okay.
And we didn't have much to do with him, actually.
Right.
So, I mean, shortly after my younger brother, who's 2 years younger than me, was born, they separated. And so they were married for, I guess, 2 to 3 years. And he did come sort of in and out of our lives a little bit, but not really, not in any serious way. And he had other families. There was a lot going on with him. Men have not figured in my upbringing, family very much, actually, I must say.
And historically as well, throughout the generations.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, actually. So I was raised much more by my mum, her parents, and my great grandmothers. I would see those as the people who really raised me and formed me.
Yeah.
So I mean, he was a nice man, and don't get me wrong, he was fun.
Sure.
And
he just wasn't as there as kind of full time.
No, and I wasn't fathered by him in that sort of as an active process. That's certainly not the case.
So Julia, 2 sons, brief sort of relationship. Dad wasn't in your life. She started in the sort of working for the
The local
basically
social
sort of the
services.
government,
Yeah.
the local social services. What was childhood like? I remember you telling me your mum worked as a dinner
She
lady.
was a dinner lady.
Was
Yeah.
it a dinner lady at your school?
Yes, it was.
Oh
Yeah,
my God!
she did
How
that
was
thing that's
that?
well, exactly. I mean, I think some mums did this at the time. I
Yeah.
seem to remember there were always mums floating around
Right.
primary schools, you know, and they were either cleaners or dinner ladies.
Yeah.
Now they're probably classroom assistants.
Yes,
That seems to be that
yeah.
they, but they were there and sort of in the background. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was always very nice. In fact, when I went to my secondary school, which was in the next town along, I was horribly homesick because my mum wasn't there at the age of 11, which is quite.
Yeah, that's a tender age.
Is it? I was going to say maybe I should have been more. Should have less tender at that age.
No.
Is
Oh
it a
God, no!
tender age, 11?
I was a soft plum.
Were you?
Age. I think I got my mum. I remember for my 11th birthday, on the day of my birthday, my mum gave me a house key. Obviously house, because she would allow me from then to walk to school on my own. So I think I was anyway. But back to you.
Well, no, I think I was quite similar. So I used to sort of go and sit in the home economics teacher's classroom at lunchtime because I didn't want to talk to any other children because I just missed my mum, you know. And yeah, it was sad. And that was in part, obviously, a symptom, I suppose, of the fact that she'd been very close and present throughout my primary education, either in the school or. Did parents sometimes? I mean, she wasn't there as a parent; she was there as an employee, obviously. But I think there were also maybe some people employed to stand in the playground at lunchtime and things like that. I think she might have done that.
I was always really scared of those women because it was invariably women.
Was it?
I never remember a man.
No,
doing that job.
I don't either.
But I think it was the power of the whistle. You know, they had those sort of really loud whistles.
I do, and they were loud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that sort of like has got.
Probably
If
still
someone
doesn't
blows a
happen.
whistle at me now,
I know.
I pay attention. I'll do what they say.
Yeah. Gosh, we've been trained for some
have.
sort of fascism.
Thanks to Julia.
Yes, she. I can't think that she was a
No,
strict
no.
one. Actually not. Probably not at all. I mean, she was a very non-strict person. She once let me stay home from school just because I felt like it. For example, and I was like, she's like, "Are you ill?" And I said, "Oh, I might." Yeah, I'm weird. Then she was very soft parent. Is a very soft parent. So yeah, she did those sorts of things, and obviously the fact that then I missed her so much at secondary school was probably because she was so present in earlier schooling. So I was a very stay-at-home, mothered sort of child, and even at school, school wasn't the great escape for me that it was for some people until I got to secondary school, and then actually it was a great escape, and then I began to feel some of the resentment that teenagers actually feel about their parents, unfortunately directed at my mum. Again, a flash in the pan in the context of a.
And when you say resentment, was it anything more than, I guess, what you'd expect from a 13, 14-year-old boy?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think it was extreme in any way. I mean, I did. Well, one unpleasant truth might be that it was slightly tainted by academic tensions on my part. I mean, so I was whisked off out of this very, very working class sort of, leave school at 16, if not earlier, sort of environment. I went off under the government's assisted place scheme, which no one really remembers now.
No, what is that?
Well, from 1979 to 1997,
Yeah.
poor children who did well on an academic exam that you received at 11 had their fees to the local independent school paid by the government.
I see. Okay.
And not just our fees, but our uniforms, our food, educational trips, but not ski
skiing.
trips. Yeah, exactly.
We're going to come skiing in a minute. But yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
It was actually quite funny to be an assisted place child, actually, because sort of the most of the time, well, we were the cleverest children in the school, of course. That was always the case because we'd been plucked from. We were ready for education, we were thirsty for education,
Yes,
desperate for education. So we were always, and that's true actually of the reports that have been done of the whole scheme sort of retrospectively by think tanks like the Sutton Trust. They've shown that assisted place pupils hugely outperform the sort of middle class children who were there because they'd been tutored into it or whatever.
But also, there's I guess a kind of psychological benchmark of. I'm not sort of reflecting on your family, but certainly mine. A psychological benchmark of what happens if you don't succeed at education, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's right.
What the sort of circumstances that kind of my parents, and I suspect your mum, grew up in and raised me and probably you in initially, act as that sort of like, okay, well, there's that, and I don't necessarily want to sort of like live like that for the entirety of my life, so I'll work hard, right?
Yes, and one for the children obviously as well. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's the other thing is that you feel that there was a strong vibe looking back on it, of sort of like, our children are going to do better, my children are going to do better than this, and that's
a great point.
I think that was very present. And I think, so coming back to my guilty confession, which it was about, part of my teenage resentment was probably directed, although I do not feel this in any way now, and I probably wouldn't have felt it in the words I'm about to use even then necessarily, perhaps looking at other families in the school,
right,
seeing houses full of books, very different ways of living. At the same time as I thought they were all incredibly pompous and stuck up, and all the other things I thought about those people, by and large, not universally, and thinking, well, maybe judging a little bit the home background, negatively judging the home background that I'd come from, by contrast with that, being at a school, after all, that praised middle-class values of the sort that I was seeing. So I think some of my teenage resentment might have been fueled by that, but probably a large part of it was just the normal hormones racing around your body, and also, obviously, gay young people feel this more strongly as well, this sort of instinct, especially in the 80s and 90s, not so much now, hopefully, when their families are more aware of well, when it's easier for them to be themselves, but this strong feeling, sort of like, I've got to get out of this, there's another place, there's somewhere I need to be, and it's not here.
There's a sense of sort of needing to take control of your own destiny, because if you don't, you're kind of subsumed into whatever normality kind of looks
and
like.
I felt that, and I think probably that came out against my mum at the time, because she was my parent, no one else. But it wasn't about her, in retrospect. That's what I can say. It wasn't about her. It was nothing she'd done. It was my situation that fostered those feelings. And actually, from the educational point of view, my going off to that school, which was a great school, by the way, and it was a great opportunity, and I made the most of it, and I enjoyed it in lots of ways. Actually, prompted her to get back into education too. So she signed up for a government scheme, which was called the 2+2 scheme, where you did 2 years at your local technical college.
Yeah.
I think this was paid for the government as well. I mean, in those days when everything was paid by the government, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
Then the 2+2 scheme sent you for the next 2 years part-time to your local university. So she went to the University of Warwick and got a BA. Wow. So I was not the first in my family to go to university, because she did it before, 3 years before I did, actually, as a mature student.
You and I share that, in that my mum, I think when I was about 13 or 14, actually probably a bit younger than that, she left school with, I think she left school age 15, went straight into work, didn't have any qualifications. And so when I was around that age, she kind of went back to school initially, did her, what would have been the equivalent of O-levels for her, but, well, actually, I think it was before then, GCSEs and A-levels. And then she had this great dream that she was going to go to Bradford University and study peace studies.
Oh, fantastic. They're the best place in the world for
there
peace
you go,
studies.
exactly.
Yeah.
So quite prestigious. And she got onto a peace studies course. Now, here's the thing. So it's hugely prestigious, and it's sort of so interesting. It's so interesting to sort of, I guess, know a person who in the latter part of their life, not later life, says, no, do you know what? I'm going to do this, and takes control of their own destiny.
Yeah.
But as a kid, what it meant was, because we grew up on welfare, right? What it meant was all the things that we got from the government, my mum, who was out of work, a lot of those went away, and so she was only surviving on a student grant.
Yeah, that was like my mum too.
Exactly
the same.
So I, unfortunately, I don't now, and I love my mum for doing this. I resented it at the time because it was harder. But I'm kind of.
Actually, she inspired me. My mum doing this inspired me.
Okay.
So in the in that time when she was doing this study, I actually feel I got something of what other children in my school had got from their own parents from her. But actually live while she was doing it. So, there was suddenly the Penguin Classic of John Stuart Mill in the house, and the Communist Manifesto, because she was doing politics.
And the Communist Manifesto,
politics and sociology was what she did at Warwick. Well, that's what her eventual degree was. I don't know quite how it did, but that's what she came out with. So that's sort of books that were suddenly in the house. I thought, oh, this is great. And so actually, I was quite inspired by what she did. They did inspire me. And I think that it was part of, encouraging me to think about university myself.
Amazing. God, there's a real sense of inspiration there. I want to come back to a couple of questions around, how your mum's informed what you're doing now and you. Before I do, and before I forget, actually, the reason I wanted to put my mum's question to you at the beginning of the podcast, the beginning of this episode, was because I think it's quite an interesting question, but also I have a little bit of a dilemma. So my mum is turning 70 this year, which is a grand birthday, and at Christmas, so she came down with my dad. They're separated, but anyway, to spend Christmas with us. I asked her what she wanted to celebrate, and she said, "Well, I want to go to Paris." I was like, "Okay, we can sort that out. That's good. I like Paris. She's never been to Paris. It'd be great, lovely thing to do. And I want to go on the Rainbow Warrior, which is Greenpeace's sort of battleship."
I remember it.
Yeah,
everyone remembers.
And
the Rainbow
it's sort
Warrior.
of if the Rainbow Warrior isn't around, its successor is, because I think it's sort of. Oh, I think they have several now. And I said, well, that might be a little difficult. She's always admired kind of Greenpeace. She's always admired this sort of very physical sense of activism as well.
Right,
So which I remember sort of her watching the news when I guess at the time the Rainbow Warrior was like being rammed by Japanese whaling boats, and she was like, "Come on, shouting at this." So obviously, that might be a bit more difficult, but that's not the dilemma. The dilemma is this: and I want to learn Ukrainian.
Ooh.
And I was like, "Oh, that's quite okay. Great. I mean, I think it's probably quite a difficult language to learn if you're not kind of in that sort of if you're not from there. Why are you interested in learning Ukrainian?" And she said, "Well, I want to go to the Ukraine and be a human shield."
Okay. I don't think human shields work in Ukraine. Is the first thing you might want to tell her.
And I think a part of her knows that. But what's interesting, and I haven't sort of spoken with her about it, I wonder if there's a sense of her wanting to leave a greater legacy, albeit in a very, I would say, responsible way. My question to you is, how on earth do I persuade my mum? I don't think she's going to do it, but like, how do I sort of get this idea out of her head?
So she really is a peacenik. I mean,
she really is.
Yeah, right. So that was why Bradford was so good for her.
Yeah.
I think you should try and encourage her onto the Rainbow Warrior instead.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that that's if she wants direct action. If she wants direct action in her life, I think encouraging her onto the Rainbow Warrior. Although that's not risk-free, of course.
But you're not going to get Mr. Putin sort of shooting long range.
No, that's true. Exactly. I mean, the idea that a human shield would be as successful. I mean, this is one of the. It'd be interesting to talk to her actually about this, because I've always wondered, what peace activists feel about that. So she goes there. She's a human shield. She dies on the first day. That's what would happen. I remember a World Humanist Congress in Oslo in 2011 on the theme of peace, and that's why it was held in Oslo. It was a very moving congress, actually, because it was held a few days, as it turned out, coincidentally, after the shootings by Anders Breivik.
Oh God, yeah.
And many of the young people who were meant to be there from the Young Humanists were dead.
Oh God.
Because there's a big crossover between the young leftists and young humanists in Norway, and the humanists, a very large organisation, so a lot of young people are involved. Anyway, it was on the theme of peace, and we had the father of peace studies, who's a very old and venerable person, and I can't quite remember his name. It might be Johan Galtung. I think it's Johan Galtung. And he was talking about his approach to peace, and he said, people asked him a question, lots of questions about what he would actually do if he was standing there in front of someone. Would he not act at all? Would he be completely passive? And he said, yes, I would stand there and I'd be shot if I was a human. And no one really could believe it and understand it. And I couldn't quite understand it either.
It's weird, isn't it?
Couldn't understand what the point of it would be, what the purpose of it would be, what the positive outcome would be. And people say, well, it's like Gandhi, but Gandhi was Gandhi. I mean,
no one's thinking Gandhi.
Right,
no.
Exactly. So the idea of a human shield is really interesting. Rainbow Warrior. Encourage her onto the Rainbow Warrior. I think that's best. But learning Ukrainian is surely a nice.
It would be great, and she could also sort of turn it to, I guess, more administrative, productive things like I don't know, helping recent Ukrainian arrivals into.
Or she could
UK.
go to Poland or to some other border countries and work with.
I think we've got a plan.
Work with women in Poland who've come from Ukraine. That's it. Learn Ukrainian for that purpose, and then she'll be able to practice her Ukrainian. There's lots of women who need abortions, who can't get them in Poland as well.
Oh, really?
They come from Ukraine into jurisdictions where gaining access to abortion is difficult. Maybe they've been raped in the course of war, so there's
yeah.
all sorts of things like that. She could find lots of humanitarian work to do, I think, rather
I
than be a
think-
human shield.
I think in the space of 30 odd seconds, Andrew, you've given my mum her life's mission in the last X number of years, however
Excellent.
she's got. Yeah,
Well,
so
hope it doesn't
well
go
done,
on
and
for that
thank you
long,
for that gift. But coming back to your mum.
Who is
did you-
not going to Ukraine, I
She's
can
not
tell
going to
you.
the Ukraine, thank
Certainly
God.
not,
Yeah, although she may well learn Ukrainian.
Mm.
What are... This sounds like a salacious question. It's not a salacious question. But what are the sort of stories from you, your childhood, maybe your adulthood, that your mum doesn't necessarily know? And the reason I ask is not sort of from a gossipy perspective, but there's certain sides, I think, of us, I can certainly speak for myself, that my mum doesn't necessarily know and understand. And it's
Yeah.
more from that perspective.
I know what you mean, because I was thinking about this in advance of coming here, and I tried to think of things that it'd be easy to try and answer that question in terms of thinking, what haven't I told my mum?
Right, yeah. Lots, I
Yeah,
imagine,
exactly, lots. Yeah, I guess so. Although I think I probably told her most things. I mean, we have a very close relationship, especially in teenage years and in early adulthood as well. And I don't feel there's anything I haven't told her sort of deliberately, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
There's nothing I've kept from her. That's certainly true. But so I tried to think instead, like, what doesn't she see of me? And I suppose I'm maybe slightly more gregarious when my mum's not around. Like, what side of I don't.
How do you mean?
Well, I think I'm probably maybe more sort of extreme in my manners. Do you think I'm an extreme in my manners sort of person? I don't know. What do you...
I, as someone who has been described as gregarious and flamboyant, no.
Flamboyant. No, I mean, I don't think I am too excessively. But I'm much less like that when I'm with my mum. I mean, I actually do find this. I mean, I think you have to accept that one acceptable answer to your question might be, well, there isn't anything, and that is a large part of my answer. Is to say, my relationship with my mum has always been very open, very honest. I've gone to her for advice in all the difficult times of my life. I've received excellent advice and unconditional love and support. In all the ways that I've been lucky to have from her, and there's nothing I've never told her. And that's been brought home to me recently, because a lot of our family have died. It's really just me and my mum now. Actually, it's strange, actually, given we started talking about what a big family we had when we were both young. But now, me and my mum, I mean, but now it's really just the two of us, and my cousin is literally our only family left in the world. And so I have actually thought a lot about what would I regret not having told her when she dies, and there isn't anything. I mean, I don't think there's anything that I've kept from her or that I haven't said. So the only way of answering the question might be, are there things about me that she doesn't observe? And then I can only say that, obviously, like we all are, when I'm with her, I'm different from when I'm with other people, but not in a massive way. So I feel like I'm pretty much an open book.
Wow,
to my mum.
What a lovely answer. And obviously it's a lovely reflection, because part of the question is the nature of your relationship with your mum, and it sounds incredibly sort of close and open.
Yes, it is.
I was thinking about this as you were talking. If you had to describe your mum, perhaps, her personality, etc., but using a story, either that involves you or sort of about her, what would kind of best epitomise Julia?
Difficult, because it's hard not to make it all about me, and it is all about me. And to some extent, I suppose.
It's all about me.
Yeah. Well, I remember once, especially when you're young, you can get yourself into situations that feel completely intractable, completely unsolvable, and they feel like the end of the world, and then you catastrophize things. And I remember in my second year at university when we had our exams, and this was, the first time really that we'd been tested inside a classicist at a university, which means our degree was 4 years long. There was an exam at the end of 2 years, another exam at the end of 4 years, and the exam at the end of 2 years was seen as quite important. And I had not done any work. I mean, this is not a secret, I think, for anyone who knew me in my first 2 years at university. I hadn't done anything. I was a terrible student. I just drank and did, other fun things in my first 2 years. I never did any work at all. I mean, I went into tutorials with blank pieces of paper and pretended they were essays and sort of like tried to read. I don't think my tutor...
Did you not sort of get this kind of anxiety, overhang anxiety before you went in.
I drank through it. That's literally true. And by the way, dear listener, I pulled myself around and changed my life in the last 2 years of my degree. But for the first 2 years, I like a lot of people, I was just released from my home environment, able to live a very different sort of life, and lived it very fully, and didn't do any work. And so I found at the end of these 2 years that I didn't have a hope. I didn't feel like I had a hope, and I felt like my life was going to be over. I mean, this sounds completely mad now because it's such a trivial thing in retrospect, but at the time. And Oxford University, I think, would be admitted to be something of a hothouse with high stakes, encouragement for you to feel high stakes about things. And I plucked up the courage to phone my mum and tell her that basically I was in the shit. And she said, "Oh well, what's the worst that can happen? I could fail." And she said, "Well, and then what?"
Yeah.
And I thought, "Oh."
She
and
just
so
added
she
that
suddenly
clarity.
she just pulled me out of it completely.
Wow.
And added a clarity. And it was, and I didn't walk away from it thinking, oh yeah, it's all fine. But I was it was like she'd lifted a burden from my shoulders, almost physically. And I suppose in that moment, it wasn't just her putting that into context with the simple way that she asked that question and framed it. It was also being made aware by her in that moment that this wasn't all that there is. In my life, that I still had my mum and my family and other aspects of my life, and that it reduced things to its proper sort of proportionate place. And I think that is an incredible thing to be able to do for someone. And she did that for me at that point. And I think she's always done that for me. I mean, I remember the first time I got drunk, which was a disaster.
How old were you?
I can't remember, but it wasn't legal, I'm sure about that.
Yeah, no
and I was at some friend's house, and they were all drinking, actually. And I don't, in case any of them are listening, or people who know them listening, I won't go through the full grisly details, but it was a shit show. And so my mum had to come and pick me up. I mean, I was not conscious of this, to be honest. And she came to my friend's house, she picked me up, and she was completely non-judgmental. In fact, she laughed, which is, I remember her laughing. And I think in part because my younger brother was there too, because he was too young to be left on his own, so which shows how young I was actually, given that he was only 2 years younger than me. And so he'd been in the car too, and apparently I was saying to my brother, like, "I love you, Lee, I love you, you're my brother. I was giving all sorts of so my mum, she didn't think this was, the best thing that could have happened, but she sort of laughed as well. I do remember her laughing. And that sort of put that all in perspective and proportion as well. When another parent could have gone absolutely mad.
Yeah, exactly. I think if I ever have children, I don't know if I will, and inevitably that will happen. I think it happens with all kids. I would have Julia's reaction, because it's objectively funny. Just to see someone in a very sort of soppy state.
Yeah.
And also, not to get too kind of intellectual about it, but I think it encourages if your child, son or daughter, is in a very kind of drunk state, and you're kind of being quite nice and caring, and they're also being quite nice and caring, admittedly, because of the alcohol, that's a better type of drunk than whatever the kind of alternative is, right?
Yes, and I had been that alternative before she picked me up, by the way. That was part of the problem.
Oh, were you kind of going
I was an
angry
drunk. Yeah. But it was a mess. It was a mess.
Yeah.
It's never happened again, actually,
Fine.
which is interesting. Never, ever happened again. I mean, I've been drunk again.
Yes, yeah.
I've never been a nasty drunk again. I don't think so, anyway. And I give you 100 moments like that. I think that's important. I mean, rather than just giving you 100 moments like those two, that's what she's done for me again and again and again.
Again, without being sort of overanalyzing the situation. How closely do you think humanism, in the way you've described it as, our place in the universe and how we shape it, informed her reaction to your first story about you getting quite, het up, and her pulling you out and giving you a greater sense of perspective about your life and place in the universe?
I think she is definitely a person who has got an enormous amount of perspective. And I suppose you're right, that must be owing ultimately, as it is for any of us, to our worldview. I mean, that's where it comes from, isn't it? If you've got a very different approach to life, for example, if you're fundamental worldview was about material success and achievement in the moment, then of course you'd have a very different reaction to my phoning. You'd say, pull yourself together, go and do some work.
Or you'd say it in Latin.
Or yes, you could say.
How would you say that in Latin?
That's been a long time.
No,
okay, I was going to do it then for you. I'm not. So you say it must be attributable to her basic approach to life. I think that's a fundamental, not basic, a fundamental approach to life. I guess that's right. But I think it's also probably down to her life experience. I mean, we went from very poor. One of the saddest stories ever. I think that I could tell about my mum is how she still feels guilty about something. She still feels guilty because once when we were somewhere, I don't know, it was on the street or in some place, she saw a £5 note on the floor and she put her foot over it and stood there, and until no one was around anymore, so that whoever she deliberately did it so that no one else, so whoever dropped it wouldn't know it was there.
Yeah.
And took it because she needed some stuff for me and my brother, and she didn't have any money. And she still feels guilty about this. I mean, how appalling to still feel guilty. Yeah, she remembers it very vividly. Very vividly. Wow. And this was in the early 80s. And, I mean, we've never been, well, it's clear from what I've said of my generational background that we've not been a wealthy family. So she's known great uncertainty, great fragility in even in the essentials of what you need for life, and so I think that actually just has put these things in proportion for her. I mean, I think she basically was like, why do you need a first at mods, and what even is that?
Exactly.
You've got a family, we've got a home you can come back to. You're alive, you're healthy.
Yeah,
exactly.
You've got your mum's love as
well.
So
I think that's right, exactly. But I think also grateful. I mean, she was always grateful her whole life that she didn't have to do what her mother did, which was be told by her mother, again, so my great-grandmother, to hide under the table when the rent man came. I mean, so it's just I think a lot of these things are not necessarily about anything as grandiose as your own sort of fundamental worldview, but just your own experience. In her case, it's taught her that just to be grateful for what is there, because it could all slip away very easily.
Final question on Julia. A lot of friends, in fact, regardless of whether they've come on the podcast or whatever, but a lot of folk in my life and guests on the podcast have come from, we should say, humble beginnings, very similar to kind of what you've described. And I think what happens in the stage of life we're at now, so in your kind of 30s, 40s, when you're a bit more financially secure, etc., there is this, whether it's compulsion or something else, I think, to give back specifically to your mum or your dad who had lived in straitened, conditions when you were younger. There is a question here, which is, do you sort of feel that, not in a sort of guilty way, but in a kind of positive way? And what are the ways in which, I guess, you treat your mum?
Yeah, I do feel that, I think, but I feel it in a slightly different way, because there's no doubt that my mum has been my parent, and she has been, and a wonderful parent and a wonderful mum. But in the last few years in particular, we've also been through a lot together. So in 2016, my grandmother died, her mum, who was very important to both of us, incredibly important to both of us. And then a year later, my grandfather died. And then the year after that, my younger brother died very suddenly. So that was obviously my mum's only other child. And then my uncle died, her only brother. And then another person who's very important to us, called Pat, who I can't quite remember. She would be a great aunt, but she was one of those. A house fell on her during the Second World War, and she was taken in by my great grandmother. And so she was like, I know, exactly. Wow. And so she had terrible difficulties throughout her life as a result. So she couldn't really live independently. So she was taken in by my great grandmother. So she was like an aunt or sister or whatever. You know how it happens in those families that are too big already, but they take in more. And so she was a very important person in her life as well. And so within those sort of 4 years, all of our entire remaining family, and the previous years, all the others had died as well, including my dad, who, even if he wasn't in our lives, we both had connections with and relationship with. and of course, most fundamentally, my brother, her youngest son. And we went through all that, I very much feel, together. So I did feel, not so much that I was giving something back to her, but that we were very mutually supportive through all of that. Obviously, the difficulties of my brother's death were much more profound for her, because obviously to have a child die is a different thing to have a sibling die, although they're both bad. Obviously, it's still the worst thing that's happened to either of us, me or my mum. But it's much qualitatively worse for her, I should think, or profound, whatever. I'd say she suffered more than I did. And so I feel that in recent years, our lives and fortunes have been stitched together a bit more as equals, I suppose, as sort of fellow travellers through life. Not just as parent and child, although that's still obviously the fundamental nature of our relationship. So, for example, she now lives with us. She's moved in.
Oh, that's so gorgeous.
Yeah, which is lovely, and throws up its own difficulties, of course, as it
sure,
as it
Does she
would
have a
do,
sort of
but she has a
an
separate.
annex?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
She has separately accessed accommodation.
That's good.
Let's say.
That's great.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's that's worked really well. That's a wonderful thing. Have I done that for her? No, we've done it for each other. I think we've got a partnership now in our lives, rather than a payback.
I massively envy you, which I think is a strange thing to say, because the convention is, oh my God, my
It's not hard to move your mum in, you can do it.
Oh, I think I've just set my own trap. Great. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that, particularly about your brother. So can I ask his name?
Lee.
Lee. And what's your sort of fondest memory of Lee? I know this is about mums, but you've
Oh,
mentioned Lee.
wow. Well, I have lots of fond memories of him, actually. Mostly when he was younger. He was quite a difficult teenager and quite a difficult young man as well. But although our relationship, thankfully, had improved a lot by the time he died. But I've just got so many fond memories of when we were children, because, of course, like I say, we were very homified, very domestic. And so, of course, we were each other's. 2 years is nothing really either in age terms. So we would play with each other all the time. And so I think probably there were just too many. I remember one very funny time when we were at a rare holiday. We didn't have many holidays when we were children, apart from that sometimes we would go and stay in my great-grandmother's house in Bournemouth, flat in Bournemouth, where me and my mum and my brother would have to sleep in one bed because she only had one spare bed. And this was right up until we were teenagers.
Oh my God!
So, I mean, I meant it about not having any money. So, but a rare holiday that wasn't all of us packed like sardines in my great-grandmother's spare bed, sort of mouldy spare bedroom. A rare holiday that wasn't that was when we went to some holiday camp, and I can't even think how we could have ended up there, really, apart from maybe someone else had paid, like, I don't know, maybe my grandparents paid or something. And there was a fancy dress competition, and I had gone as a caveman with like an old Coke bottle wrapped in brown paper. My brother wanted to go as a mummy and couldn't be convinced not to, so he'd been wrapped up in loo rolls from head to toe. And halfway through, his loo roll started coming off, and he started crying. And the man who was running this fancy dress competition or whatever it was, the Haven Holiday Camp, the Tiger Club or whatever, I don't know. Tiger Club sounds right, actually. Maybe it was called the Tiger Club. Started sort of like making fun of him. And so I started beating him on the head with my Coke bottle. And someone had to come and stop it. It's the only time in my life that I've been physically violent. Would you believe that?
And with good reason.
And with good reason. And so I do remember, but with the so that the event itself is not the memory. Because there's a photo of it where my brother is like crying. He's so tiny. He's like, he's this tall. It breaks your heart even now to look at it. And I'm there, sort of hating this memory thing. And so the happy memory is that we would remember that so often through our lives, even though actually probably by then we didn't really remember it properly. But we would, and we would laugh about it every Christmas, that sort of thing. And really that just stands in as a proxy as well for many happy memories like that. The sort of memories that you have with a young brother who's close in age and you've grown up with.
It's
in a very
wonderful to be able to
small
repeat
household.
it as well at Christmases, at family gatherings. I was also in the Tiger Club. Do you remember the Tiger Club anthem?
Here we are in the Tiger Club. Was it that?
that was they might have evolved it, but there was
Did you go more than once? Because this is once. I'm dragging this up from one. It was obviously a golden trip.
I went a few times.
Oh God, what was it then? Was it a real thing? The Tiger Club?
It was no, it was a Tiger Club for humans. It was something like we're looking for rhinos, we're looking for cheetahs, we're looking for something big alligators. From something to little bear cubs. We're having fun in the Tiger Club. Yes.
Oh wow. I had no idea if that was real or whether I'd...
No, it's absolutely real.
Head.
Yeah,
and was it Butlins? It can't be
Butlins had a different club, but...
So what was it called then? Was it Haven?
Haven Tiger Club. Yeah.
I got that out of the depths of my
Yeah,
memory.
well done.
Oh,
God.
Our one holiday. That's why I remember it so well.
I want to finish with, ironically, asking you, ask a question of my mum. So something we're trying to do in this series is to get her to kind of be part of it a little bit more, because it's obviously my mum made me. So I'd love you to put a question to her, and she will answer it in the form that she sends me a voice note every Friday. Bless her, so adorable.
How do you feel about the voice notes?
I love them.
Do you like them?
I love them. Sometimes my mum does actually listen to this podcast. She's the one who, no, I'm joking. She does listen. I love them. Sometimes they're a little bit perfunctory.
Oh.
What I mean, no, not in a bad way, but there's a formula. So every Friday I'll get a voice note. I should play one, but I quite like doing impressions of my mum. Bless her. Like,
you do a good accent.
Hello, Paul. Hello, Adam. Hugs and kisses to you, and Lemon and Yuzu, our two cats. It's Friday. It's your weekend. Have wonderful weekends. I love you. Bye. Mwah. And it's gorgeous to receive that. It's pro forma every Friday. But I would not dream of asking her to stop, because I just love receiving them, no matter how they are. So yes, knowing what you know about my mum, I'd love you to ask her a question.
Well, I've learned a lot about her now. I think I would like to know a little bit more about her views on peace, actually. I would like to know, would she ever break the rules of peace, for example, to defend you?
Oh, that is a great question.
Would she do more than be a human shield for you? Would she do violence for you?
That's a fantastic question.
Is that too intrusive?
No, not at all. And she would actually love answering that question, because I think she probably has thought about it.
She must have thought about it. Because it's a question for peace people. In fact, the man I was mentioning in Oslo, someone asked him, if you were between you and your daughter, and would you still not do violence? And he said, no, I wouldn't. He said, I'd try and persuade them not to hurt her.
Okay.
But,
Go on, hon.
I know. Yeah, exactly. So I'd like to know what your mum would do, and how she'd feel about it, and how she'd justify it.
Well, I will get her to answer it.
Yeah.
I will send you the voice note, and I'll obviously play it on the
Good.
next episode as well. Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brilliant.